Welcome everyone to another edition of This is Revolution Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Miles. I'm once again in a different location. Hopefully this won't be a permanent situation, but today I'm broadcasting live from the John F. Kennedy Public Library in Vallejo, California. I didn't know that there's little rooms that you can get in the library and it costs you nothing. Tax dollars working for you. Now, before I even introduce my co-host, my homie, my dog, our guest for today was not able to make it. He said he got very ill. Whenever I hear people say that, my first thought is, oh shit, hope he didn't get COVID. So let's send some positive energy out to Jacobin co-editor, and I believe he's writing a book on Eugene Debs, Sean Good. That being said, we found some very suitable fill-ins. Before we even get to those guys, let's bring in the man, the myth, the legend, Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles.
Someone says I'm dressed like a cool substitute teacher. It's really hot. It's like 20 degrees hotter in the city that I'm in. So I had to find something somewhat cool. You know, I'm going to bring, before we play the clip, I'm going to bring everyone in, because I want people to know about the superstar guests that we got. They're not really guests. They're kind of like parts of the show as well. Would you agree with that, Pascal? These guys are like parts of the show as well.
Meh. Yes, they are. Yes, they are. They are. They are.
Tough crowd, please. Coming all the way live from Mormon country. Formerly host of Theorizing with the Hammer and Pop the Left. Now he is just the man. I shouldn't say just the man. He is the man at Varn Vlog. The shit starter. I'm not going to let you forget that, D. Derick Varn.
I have no idea how this topic's going to connect to the dreaded AP word. So
I have a list of things you guys probably can't read, but it's a few things to know. And one is, you'll never guess what Cuba's insignia stands for. And Varn started the Afro-pessimist debate. And I said I have amazing friends that I love dearly. So I want you guys to know that. Another friend that I love dearly, he is broadcasting live from a bunker somewhere in the great Northwest. He is the representative of the deep state. Deep state, Cuba.
Hello, everyone. Sorry I haven't been more active recently, but there was a Canadian election and I needed to fix it before I could resume. Is there any way that we can retcon Varn's backstory so he's Indonesian? Because I'd really like to call him the shit starter from Jakarta.
The shit starter from Jakarta. Sounds like a restaurant.
Yeah. After the Thrilla from Manila, it's Southeast Asia's greatest export.
The shit starter from Jakarta.
People are all excited about the topic. I'm seeing Red Wizard. It's time to Mao Eugene Debs. Let's go.
So we made a video for this. So I have to make a lot of these clips now kind of ahead of time to get life stone to curveball. I'm trying to stay back in the batter's box. And sometimes like Pascal has these ideas sometimes, and he just starts just farting out ideas left and right about shows he wants to do. And sometimes Mean Gene Bajlan goes, "Oh, I got somebody for your ass. You want to do that Debs show?" So Pascal's like, "I want to talk about Eugene Debs, motherfucking cracker." You know how he talks. And so Gene puts the show together, and then I was like, "Pascal, come on, I need to get the blurb for this show. What we're gonna say, because I know there's a certain way you want to handle this Debs thing. You don't just want a history. You don't just want to talk about his activism in the labor movement. You want to really get at this guy." So Pascal writes the blurbs, and it's me. I put the video together. As I'm putting the video together, I'm trying to find any video footage of Debs being mean to black people, and I couldn't find any. Pascal.
I didn't say you were going to find video footage.
But what I did find was a whole lot of Bernie Sanders speaking for Eugene Debs.
Oh, here we go.
He really loves Eugene Debs.
Ugh.
He recorded an album of Debs like speeches in the 70s. I didn't take any of that for this clip, but I did get a person that actually knew Eugene Debs. So let us watch this extremely short clip, and then Pascal and I will be angry, and then Kuba and Varn will stick up for Debs.
That's not what's going to happen.
No? Okay, fine. Ruin everyone's fun.
In the history of the United States, only half a dozen people stand out as great leaders, great humanitarians. And I think Debs should be so recognized as one of the great, humane, lovable people that's come into the world.
Heralded as one of the greatest socialist leaders of the 20th century, Eugene Debs is often remembered as a champion of labor rights and the working class. However, many voices have questioned Debs' dedication to the struggle of black workers. In this episode, we will discuss the legacy of Eugene Debs. This is Revolution.
As a wage worker, I came to realize the oppressions and suffering of the working class and to understand something of the labor question.
Did you like the outer space part at the end, Pascal?
It was rather cool.
Okay. I do all this shit for you to go, hey.
Brother, I've never questioned your intro video making abilities. You always impress me, and you get better and better with time.
Correct.
Take it. I will take it. So, Eugene Debs. For those that don't know, Varn, you want to give us a quick backstory on Debs?
Debs was born in 1855. No, I mean, he was a major socialist politician, ran for president 4 times, and went to prison, I believe, twice. Definitely the biggest, the most important one was opposing when he went to prison and ran a campaign from prison opposing Wilson. He was a Democratic politician in the late 1870s, 1880s, and began working in the Railroad Federation, started calling for industrial unionization around the turn of the century. Also became a socialist politician, broke with Gompers in 1902, and started thinking the AFL-CIO was not going to be as useful as the original. I mean, AFL-CIO, AFL was not going to be as useful as he thought. He founded the IWW, or co-founded it, He co-founded the Socialist Party of America, which was the largest socialist organization in U.S. history, probably. It's hard to know actually at its high point which was bigger, the SPA or the CPUSA in the 30s. The numbers aren't entirely clear. So I mean that's the shortcut about him. His positions. He's one of the few people who radicalizes increasingly with age. He opposed striking in the 1870s. I mean that's something that's often forgotten about him.
Well, he was a capitalist, from my understanding, because he felt that this great expansion of industrialism.
Yeah, he was a Whiggish capitalist liberal Democrat. And we have to remember that the Democratic Party of 1880 is 20 years out from being the party of the Civil War. The party of the Civil War reactionaries.
The
Dixiecrats. Yep, the Dixiecrats and all that. He starts off, he believed in a labor compact very early on too. But he abandons all that through the strike waves of the 1890s. That's when all that really starts to change. And so during that time period, he starts not only supporting striking, but thinking that the Knights of Labor and then the AFL weren't doing enough. And he becomes increasingly radical. There are, however, his position on race is not easily discernible from time period to time period. He starts off basically as a liberal Democrat in the party of the Confederacy. And that's pretty much undeniable. He initially supports segregation on trains. He initially supports the Knights of Labor's position on black and immigrant labor. But by 1902, he opposes Gompers as keeping the unions racially segregated. By 1905, he begins to really push against Victor Berger, who is an outright xenophobe. In fact, when the early Social Democrats and then the Bolsheviks list their criterion of socialists who should be excluded from the International, jingoistic socialists are included, and they specifically have Victor Berger in mind. So he's a complicated figure in that his positions change and become more and more radical. And unfortunately, in a lot of the socialist hagiography about him now, they don't talk about his early development very much. It's something that it is seen as kind of embarrassing. That's a very, very quick capsule run through of the man. He's obviously quite complicated.
Well, everything I've read about Debs, and I definitely watched my share of videos too the other day, getting ready for this show. Why do you think? This question goes out to the panel, not just Varn. Why do you think that when we look back on Eugene Debs, we definitely don't really look back on his early years? Why is that omitted from the canon?
I'd like to pick this up. I think that because Debs is basically considered a martyr to American socialism, and particularly to the democratic socialist version of socialism that has become prevalent in America today. And frankly, there are a faction of people who are socialists or leftists or soc Dems who cling to the purported militancy of Debs as a way of shoring up their bona fides in the face of the fact that the Communist Party, the CPUSA, was always more radical on the labor question, was always more radical on the black question and was always, quite frankly, more brutally surveilled by the state than the socialists. And frankly, the socialists like to cling to Debs because of, his imprisonment and his kind of martyrdom and all that stuff, as kind of like, look at our guy, he's radical too, because he gives this posture of militancy in the face of the fact that for the large part of the early 20th century, the American socialists, definitely the Socialist Workers' Party and the other socialists, were racist as hell. And they didn't give a damn about black people. And frankly, one of the main reasons why people like Cyril Briggs and a lot of the early blacks would not join the Socialist Workers' Party or the Socialist Party, even though Hubert Harrison was a socialist and A. Philip Randolph, people like Cyril Briggs, the African Black Brotherhoods, the reason why they became the early members of the CPUSA and the Communist Party after the Bolsheviks is because the communists made a direct, hardline stance that not only was the black liberation a part of challenging capitalism and labor unity, it was the front line agenda of the Comintern internationally.
Well, until 1936.
Until 36, because of the Popular Front.
Right, exactly.
I think that Pascal is absolutely right, and I would just also suggest that there's feeling that Eugene Debs is unproblematically American. He appears he gets a positive profile in the America trilogy of John Dos Passos. You encounter him in history books. He's the Wobblies are kind of this indigenous working class socialist movement in the United States, while the Communist Party, for a lot of people who, throughout the Cold War, it was just toxic for Americans, even sympathetic to the left, because it was adversarial, and the communism seems foreign to America, even in pre-Soviet, Karl Marx German variations, while Eugene Debs gives socialism an American founding father. That's easy for people to embrace.
The early communists in the United States tended to be not only European immigrants, but also black immigrants. There were a lot of Afro-Caribbean
as well,
that gravitated to communism early on. But let's not forget that very quickly that communism spread in the South amongst African Americans. It was not simply a Northeastern phenomenon. And let's also not forget that we had two factions of we had the CPUSA, and I believe the communist. What was the other faction that was more American and less European immigrant based? So they developed a very strong American non-immigrant support for the Communist Party as well. But I will agree with Kuba that in the beginning, the communist movement was largely European immigrants, black immigrants, some black Americans, but that changed relatively rapidly, particularly when the CPUSA developed its black belt thesis that argued for black self-determination and autonomy in the South.
And anti-lynching. I mean, we have to keep that in mind.
And let's not forget, thank you, Jason, the 800-pound gorilla in the room that basically told many of the black leftists that the Socialist Party wasn't about shit, was that they would not fight lynching.
Right. I mean, and what happens in the 1920s? I mean, why the SPA collapses from a group that contends between 9 and 20% of the vote, depending on who you listen to, which no socialist movement after that is done, is that the left of the SPA immediately went into 3 different parties, one of which was the CPUSA. I mean, so the people who were around Debs, who were his support in the left of the SPA, left between 1917 and 1921, and a lot of that has to do with not knowing how to deal with communism and not really. Debs, despite his leadership of the party, never really won within the party against the right of the Socialist Party within the Socialist Party of America. Even though he was the head figure, the Berger position was the more dominant position within the SPA.
Do you guys think that the reason why that was the dominant position is because the majority of Black people still at this point in time are agricultural workers in the South? And a lot of this, the bigger players in this movement are in these metropolitan cities.
Let me tell you why I don't think that's an excuse. Because we're talking about less than 20 years after the populist movement, and you have the Colored Farmers Alliance, which is one of the most militant labor movements in the history of Black America, that is in the South, that is working with the White Farmers Alliance, not necessarily in a romanticized way. So the notion that agricultural workers were not able to mobilize on labor issues challenging Southern urban capital, I don't find to be a justifiable excuse to basically not take their issues under concern. We're talking about Black folk who were in the South who were literally challenging the clan Southern aristocracy with their lives to challenge capital. One of the greatest movements probably in the history of this country that no one in Black America talks about today, largely because they were willing to work with white people, probably not in a romantic way. There were a lot of problems. There was a lot of racism. But the bottom line is, let's not forget that Black elites like Booker T. Washington, Anna Julia Cooper were financed and supported by, Southern bourbon capitalists to completely gut the populist era movement and the Colored Farmers Alliance and the Farmers Alliance because they challenged capital. That's exactly. I remember on social media less than 3 days ago, I saw Black people celebrating, the 100 something anniversary of Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise speech. I was like, have you ever read Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise speech? It was racist, it was anti-immigrant, it was xenophobic, and he basically said that Black people would agree to be almost kind of like docile tools of American capitalism without challenging them, and not give them any kind of labor or union problems like these other immigrants. This is a man, by the way, that speech, some people argue, wasn't even totally written by Booker T. Washington, who almost always had a ghostwriter, who was being financed largely by American capitalism to completely gut one of the most militant Black labor movements in the country.
You're the first person to say Booker T. Washington had a ghostwriter.
This is known. A lot of people know this.
So what I find fascinating about the issue with Debs is not so much that Debs was a racist, because I think if you compare him to even most of the socialists of the same time period, he was relatively progressive. It's that it hides the fact that the SPA didn't do much about this, and it hides the fact that the SPA didn't do much about yellow card journalism. And while the Wobblies, which also are historically connected to Debs, did take better stances on that, when it comes to the South, after Matewan, they give up. I mean, they just don't try anymore. They pretty much cede the entire region. So the only people working that area become the communists, largely through trying to work with Black agrarian labor. And the communists also do something a little differently, I think partly because of the racial issue and the idea of the Black Belt nationhood, and I think also partly because they don't treat sharecropping as peasantry. They treat it as agrarian proletarianization, which means that their view of agrarian workers is different from people who view sharecroppers as small proprietarians like large peasants or whatever, which they kind of were not. They did not really, I mean, they were subject to rentiers. They didn't really own the land, and they didn't really even own their own crops. So calling them petit bourgeois or proto-petit bourgeois in any way totally misleading. But it was common, and it was also common actually after the 40s. And that's why I had that little snide comment about after 1936, because a lot of this stuff in the CPUSA gets snuffed out too, not just because of the Red Scare, but because of the Popular Front and the fact that to form the Popular Front, they had to side with the Democrats, who had not yet even begun to purge their racist base in the South. That was the main of the Democrats until hell, almost into the 1980s in some areas. So it's something that I think our history of this is totally distorted, and a lot of the people talking on this basically want to make the U.S. the problems of the U.S. left totally disappear by focusing on a few heroic figures and only in select periods of their life.
Well, I mean, quite frankly, part of the problem we have also is that we have people on the left today in America who are afraid of the C word, i.e. communism or communist, and they don't want to be associated with it. And they were like, oh, people like socialism. Socialism is okay. That's fine. And by the way, I'm not a communist. I am a socialist. But I don't have a problem with admitting that communists did more aggressively to challenge capitalism in the movement in the United States in the early 20th century before the Popular Front than the socialists did. And they were much more aggressive by far, even after the Popular Front, than any time the socialist parties in this country ever were in dealing with
the American Negro Labor Coalition that got started out of the Communist Party.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you were a black activist, even in the 50s, if you wanted a living and you couldn't get a respectable job with like the NCAA,
NCAA.
The whatever. I can't. My acronyms are totally blurring together there. And you could get that job. You actually could get a decent living from working for the Communist Party, because they would actually pay you, and they really didn't discriminate on hiring practices. I mean, that's like a lot of like the Black cultural renaissance was actually funded by the CPUSA. But it is. I think Pascal's right. We still have the legacy of the Red Scare, people being afraid of the
Cold War.
Yeah,
not to mention the Cold War.
Yeah, totally. We also have the fact that on the more radical left, if you encountered the CPUSA in the 90s or the aughts, they were basically just, how do I say this nicely? Democrats with Stalin paraphernalia.
Yeah.
So like, because I encountered them in the aughts, and I was just like, wait, you're telling me to go vote for Barack Obama? Okay. I mean, I guess, sure. So there is that immediate history too, but I think the bigger deal, honestly, is that not only has the CPUSA kind of, it has the Cold War, it has the Red Scare, it's also kind of been scrubbed in Black cultural history. Like, no one taught me that Lorraine Hansberry and Richard Wright were both in the CPUSA.
Yeah. You can watch her documentary. They don't really talk about that. The 2-hour documentary on her doesn't really get it too much into that either.
Probably one of the first things that Jason and I, one of the first conversations we had when we started doing the show together, was that we were both motivated in reintroducing Black left history to contemporary Americans, Black or otherwise, because this history had been so lost. Not to play show me the books I'm reading, but The Cry Was Unity, Communists and African Americans, 1917 to 1936, by Mark Solomon. Very good.
I just
Hammer
ordered it.
and Hoe.
I was going to say Hammer and Hoe.
Hammer and Hoe.
I was going to say
Hammer
Hammer
and
and Hoe.
Hoe by Robin D.G. Kelly. Very good book as well. Now, I don't want to trigger Cuba too much this here because he's like, we're talking about the communists and, his Stalin nerves are about to explode in front of us and whatnot. But I know some of the Marxist-Leninist comrades are going to be like, I don't necessarily believe that you necessarily have to be a communist and be a Stalinist. I think we can critique Stalin, and we can say, he had his errors, he made his contributions. We can talk about this is my position on all of this. I think that is ridiculous in 2021, after 50 years of capitalist realism and neoliberalism, but we barely have a fart sniff of a left for us to be arguing about burying Stalin or Socdems or Trots or MLs or anarchists or Lovestonites or anyone else again, where most people don't care or know what any of this shit is about.
Agreed.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say something because my name was mentioned, and the reality is that the Communist Party is more than the Soviet Union. It's more than the People's Republic of China. And especially when you look at the early part of the 20th century, you have movements all over the world that are agents of some significant social change and positive social change. And to universally, purge the part of the left that has the communist label without examining what different groups and individuals at different periods have done that throws away some very valuable legacies and not just in the United States, but the national liberation struggles of things like the Viet Minh or the Cuban communists. Those are success stories in a lot of ways, and it's this tangled American problem with how to think of communism, how to think of communists who seem to do things that even American liberals sometimes like. The label becomes too challenging, and someone like Eugene Debs allows you to get away from all of that discomfort with all American.
I was going to say, is it a
founding
wholesome
fathers.
thing? The Terre Haute, Indiana native, being radicalized in actually working in the railways to want to change the way we look at labor. I mean, he does have people in the chat are throwing out these factoids about Eugene Debs, but trust me, it's really not as simple as some factoids of him not wanting to speak in front of segregated audiences at a certain point in his life. Eugene Debs said and did some. There's a reason why we're doing this show, and it does revolve around the Negro question.
I mean, I think to be fair, right? It would be easy if I wanted to put on my Mao hat and use terms like, oh, Eugene Debs was just a typical leftist cracker, crass reductionist, blah, blah, blah. But to be fair to Debs does evolve on his racial politics and becomes the more militant on Black justice and equality than most of his socialists towards the later part of his life in the early 20th century. Let's be very clear. This is a man who was rigorously praised by Hubert Harrison, famous Black socialist, rigorously praised by A. Philip Randolph, well-known socialist, was very loved and admired by W.E. Du Bois, well-known American socialist, and came a long way in arguing that the American labor movement had to not only include, but had to stand for the rights of black labor and black workers and black political equality.
But where did he stand on on segregation?
And
he was an
Go ahead.
integrationist by the 20th century.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would agree with that by the 20th century. Yes.
He is not in his early political career. I mean, that's like, I think with Debs, what you see is someone who starts off as kind of a low-key bigot. And when I say low-key, like comparing him to the rest of the Democratic Party, and ends up kind of progressive on race. I mean, not kind of. He was definitely progressive on race. But in this terms of even the socialist movement in the 1920s. And he was also progressive in immigration. But it is not overnight and it is not instant, and that can't be ignored. His early positions are the same positions as the Knights of Labor, and they're only slightly to the left of the Democrats, and only through actively dealing with trying to organize labor movements in the 1890s does he stop to drop those positions. And so I think he is really a figure who does learn on the ground. But if you focus solely on him, right, like you miss what American U.S. socialism was in the early 20th century and the late 19th century. Like it was until 1914, it was railed to the right of most of the European socialist parties. 1914 is weird because that is the period where the U.S. Socialist Party takes the right position and the German Socialist Party takes the wrong one. And that pretty much gives us most of what happens in World War II, if we're completely honest. But until that point, you would have thought that like the American socialists were just, like that they were willing to have Klansmen in their midst. And some of them were. I mean, that cannot be denied, even though that in and of itself is what killed the ability for the South to unionize. Like the South never, ever unionized. Like I lament, like personally, because I'm born in Georgia, I lament that the CPUSA didn't finish its work in the South after 1936. Like that's actually like a big historical sore point for me. But they did more than anybody else did. Go read the Socialist Workers' Party, the early Trotskyist Party, was well to the right of Trotsky on race. Like that's and pretty late. That only really stops in the 1960s.
Well, isn't the Socialist Party line pretty much like these black? This black agriculture labor is never going to be part of the proletariat revolution. So unfortunately, I had all these quotes from Debs highlighted, and I forgot it.
Essentially, yeah, that basically they were retrograde peasant labor and analogous to kulaks in Europe at worst, and just backwards labor at best, and they would be like the rear guard of the revolution at best. That was the stance.
And the Russians saw it differently. Does anyone want to get into how the Russians viewed black agriculture?
Well, Stalin was a big supporter of the Black Belt thesis proposed by Harry Haywood. Stalin was also a strong advocate of fighting for black autonomy, political autonomy in the South. If you read a quote by Robin D.G. Kelly about Hammer and Hoe, Stalin is sending correspondence to black Southerners that he's willing to send in, military to the United States if the Southern, aristocracy messes with them.
Go for it.
Although I'd point out that there was a Soviet school of international realpolitik that recognized the mobilization of minority groups in opposing states as an effective destabilization tactic. And I think that it was most effective for that real political goal when it was also ideologically consonant. So, for instance, in South Africa or in the United States, where you have a aggressive adversary of the Soviet Union and international communist movement, that's also ideologically odious through racialized capitalist exploitation. That's that it's very easy to get comrades behind that. But it wasn't entirely the ideological motivator, or a humanitarian motivator. It was partly the Soviet painted into a corner, internationally isolated, lots of enemies, very few friends, play to try to break its encirclement by weakening some of its rivals.
Yeah, but I mean, why was the Soviet Union being painted into a corner? Because it was an anti-capitalist political movement in the world of capitalist imperialism, and ideologically it wanted to break capitalism. To say that they were doing realpolitik in line with the ideology as a Soviet project is not problematic when their project is to end capitalism.
No, I'm just pointing out that there is that international political dimension to it, and the Soviets sometimes were willing to foreclose on groups that they had once supported if there's
the African or the American Negro labor. Was it coalition or Congress? Was it Congress? Can't remember what the C stood for.
Well, I think that we will all agree that the rise of fascism and the Popular Front puts a serious chink, is an understatement, in the effectiveness of the Communist Party USA in the United States. I say all the time, I don't give a damn. I think the Popular Front was the biggest mistake the left and the Communist Party have made in the United States. It was a nightmare. The left never recovered from it, and it basically shut leftism down in the U.S.
There's something that we should talk about because a super chat got put out.
Chat did. Let me bring it back up. You guys, can you hold on for me? Can finish.
Somebody threatened to talk to Gene, which is a little like asking to speak to the manager, and now I'm anxious.
Talking to Gene. That's like saying, I need your district manager's number.
Mm-hmm. This is going straight to corporate.
Gene Bajlan is the district manager of Leftist Podcast.
But it's a good question. So
did you remember? Here it is. Sorry, guys. Here it is. What are folks' preference on free markets versus central planning? I assume there's a preference that socialists and communists might differ in.
So let me take a first stab at that. The whole question of markets versus planning only comes up after the Russian Revolution, when the Bolsheviks have to come up with a political economic model for a post-revolutionary society.
The NEP.
Yeah, the NEP. And the NEP is interesting because it combines planning with markets at the local scale, especially for agricultural produce, with farmers basically operating like small-scale capitalists, while the commanding heights of the economy, that's Lenin's famous phrase, are subject to greater degree of central planning. Then with the 5-year plan, the market elements of the NEP are abolished. You have collectivization of agriculture, and you have full-on central planning across the entire economy. So the post end of NEP, in the Stalin period and onwards, communism is intrinsically linked with central planning as the main political economic expression of the ideology. Socialists are more ambivalent about whether or not markets need to be replaced by central planning, and the utility of central planning in achieving either welfarist or developmental goals for specific states that might have a socialist or a left-wing government. And that, especially in the European context where you have socialist parties, in France, Mitterrand is a socialist president, the that's a major distinction between Soc Dems and communists. The willingness for socialists to work with capitalist markets, domesticate them, tame them, but allow them to operate on some scale, versus communists that abolish those markets entirely and replace them with central planning.
I would add to and complicate that by after the 1980s that most of the Soc Dems are no longer Marxist, even of the market variety. They're Keynesians and post-Keynesians, and that the communists are also embracing markets again, such as in
China, Vietnam,
and the liberalization of Vietnam. Correct. My personal answer to this is I think Soviet cybernetic theory gets us out of a lot of these contradictions. And before Soviet cybernetic theory, I think the NEP, as run by Bukharin specifically, is probably the best way to go. After Soviet cybernetic theory, I wish they hadn't abandoned it to the capitalist, because we don't really know what it could have been used for. I mean, you have Allende kind of playing with it a little bit with CyberStem, but it was not. That was only a small element of what the Soviets were trying to do in the 50s. And it's a good Soviet technology that gets given to the capitalists, and the capitalists get to develop the internet, unfortunately, and a lot of other social technologies based off of it. And when I say cybernetic, I do not mean computers fix all your problems. I mean studying the way feedback loops work in human systems, which is what the internet is based off of, not just the computer part of it or the interface. So my answer is that the question is somewhat irrelevant now, because also in no capitalist country at this point do you not have central planning. So that's also kind of a misnomer.
Well, there's a difference between central planning and privatized planning. In that,
yes.
Yeah. And in one of my big motivators to study political science was to figure out how development ever happens. And in the case of the East Asian miracle and post-war European reconstruction, you have planning agencies basically left over from World War II that provide a blueprint, and with mandates, incentives, and goals that private producers then work towards. A kind of hybrid system.
This starts with state planning after military expansion that basically incentivizes private sector to follow after, with massive government subsidies, by the way, to follow through on technology.
And non-competition agreements too, which is
non-competition agreements.
Yeah, cartelization.
So I think the whole debate is a charade, because my argument is that capitalism doesn't happen without the state in the 20th century, or ever, quite frankly.
That's correct. The idea that there's a free market version of capitalism where you just let people do whatever and you end up with Nevada or New Hampshire is entirely fanciful. It's an ideological delusion of the libertarian right. And the state is essential to not just establishing the institutions of a free market, but also pushing developmental projects through, usually by the defense budget, and using public money to push technology into everyday use.
I would the only thing I would add to this is that in classical Marxism and classical Orthodox Marxism, as stated in the Critique of the Goethe program, it is clearly stated that Marx thinks in the transition between capitalism, socialism, and communism, and that's a weird distinction that he only makes in that text. It's not made anywhere else. He admits that bourgeois elements will still exist in the early stages of the transition, and that has been what those bourgeois elements are not defined. So we don't know if it's, if he means markets, if he means parts of the state apparatus, because the nation state, as we understand it, is, as Marx is a capitalist innovation as opposed to the feudal kingdoms, etc. We don't. It's not clearly defined because it's a text that, unfortunately, even though it's the one where Marx makes it the most clear, is also one that he suppressed himself for socialist unity reasons during his lifetime and was only published after his death. So I would say that it's a non-question that neither socialism might have something like markets, even non-market socialism, like when you look at stuff like councilist planning regimes and council communism and Cybersyn, all of them have market-like information bearers, as did actually the 5-year plan. And we have to kind of admit that, and I say this deliberately and somewhat inflammatorily to kind of piss off everyone, Stalin taking Trotsky's advice about collectivizing agriculture super quickly was a world historical disaster. And me saying it that way is deliberate. Because the big advocate for that before Stalin does it is Trotsky. And in his fights with Lenin and Bukharin. So it's, and I always find it ironic when, like Trotskyists will bring up the famines as a critique of Stalinism. I'm like, well, there's many things that you can legitimately critique Stalinism on that Trotsky is not responsible for. And he may not be responsible for this either, but this was also his policy.
Well, and I think that this actually shows some common ground with the turn away from organizing African agricultural labor in the United States. There is a bias in Marxism that derives from the elevation of the proletariat, the industrial proletariat, above the peasantry, and then this confusion about where do we draw the line between the traditional feudal peasantry and different forms of capitalist exploitation in the countryside.
Well, who comes along to remedy all those problems, my friend. We've got some Maoists in the room. Maoists in the room. Maoists in the room. Here come all the Maoists in the room. Maoists in the room. Maoists in the room.
Although that's a really interesting point, because I think that you might be able to make an argument that traditional Chinese agriculture had been marketized much earlier than agricultural production elsewhere, like the landlordism and squeezing peasant labor was a fact of life that they had complained about, since the Ming Dynasty, since the Han Dynasty.
Right. It was very old in China.
Exactly. So I think that this is a way in which communism with Chinese characteristics actually fills in some omissions from the straight version of communism, and picks up some developments that had been missed, especially in terms of the revolutionary potential of the agricultural population, and and the shift in different modes of exploitation in the countryside, where so many Western Marxists just have feudalism on the brain and can't see beyond it.
Well, I mean, I do think this is a legit problem with
part of the problem with that also is, let's not forget that the Soviet project is dealing with a feudal peasant agricultural economy that industrializes basically under Stalin. So this whole problem that Marxists have is like, well, we need to have an industrial society for us to truly be able to have Marxism. And Marx really said that socialism can only develop in the West. It's kind of bullshit, because the Soviet Union was a fucking feudalist peasant society based on agriculture. And yes, we do know that Marx said that the last place he expected socialism to be able to take off was in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, although he also thought that if socialism could develop without going through capitalism, it actually would be in Russia. I mean, so you have that. You have that
it's
weird contradiction.
It's the Incan Empire problem, right? Like, you can get industrialized socialism in Russia, but you'll be doing it yourself, which means that the blood of all of those peasants, all of those workers, is on you.
Well, we're acting as if the Industrial Revolution in the West, even though it took place over maybe 30, 40, 50 years, didn't have buku peasant labor blood.
But that's where the leftists, especially the Marxists, could get on their moral high horse, right? You capitalists did all of this. We just want to distribute the gains more equitably. We are humanitarians. You guys are monsters. And then, the Incan Empire and the Soviet Union.
Well,
and
I think part of the, if we want to get into Russian, like I blame Plekhanov probably because he's the person who abandons Marxist theory about the peasants' councils being able to piggyback on capitalist development in Europe and just skip over it. By being able to adopt European technologies, probably maybe even before socialism fully develops in Europe. He does write that in the letter to Verzulek, but it's ignored, partly because it wasn't well known. It was not a public letter. So the Russian Marxists didn't know about it for the most part. And when they did, they thought it was already too late to happen, that the peasant councils had already been too deracinated by the attempt at bourgeois development under the Tsar. So, like, we have a whole history there. I think the Chinese case is more interesting in a lot of ways because Mao was in some ways more attuned to the fact that there was no way that there was going to be a revolution in China without peasant labor, and B, that the conditions of historical development in China did not follow the model prescribed in Marx, although when he comes up with that, to be honest, he hadn't read Marx yet. It was just sort of an intuition that he had. I mean, the other thing you must remember is, like, in China, Kropotkin gets translated, and that's the first thing that I think Mao reads. Then Stalin and Lenin, and Marx kind of drifts in later, and was translated kind of in the 1920s concurrently to the things actually beginning on the ground. And from everything I've read about Mao's intellectual biography, he reads Marx last, and because of that, he doesn't have the Espède's interpretive framework of Marx, because he's not really getting it. He does have Stalin and Lenin's, for good and for bad, but he develops this on his own. And similarly, actually, to bring this back to Debs, I mean, part of the thing about Debs, when we want to deal with what he thought about Marx, or about, because he did read Marx, but what Marx that was available in America was like the Manifesto. Articles that he had written in German in New York for a New York newspaper, but you had to read German to know them. And so, like, the American socialist movement is also kind of developing on its own. There are British translations of Marx that filter in, but in the 19th century, there's not a lot to work off of either. In either place, and probably, I mean, less than you'd even have in Russia. In Russia, that stuff was highly suppressed. So, I actually have tried to figure out what Marx was available in the U.S., but a lot of it's the early 20th century. So, I mean,
we are at an hour, and they're telling me at the library. No, they're not telling me yet, but they did tell me that, hey, man, we're going to kick you out of here well before 8 o'clock. Someone asked in the chat, and I do want to ask Pascal this, since this was the show that he wanted to do. I'm going to ask Pascal first, and after Pascal answers, I would like the panel to chime in. But what is the moral of this Eugene Debs tale? What is the legacy, in your opinion, Pascal, of Eugene Debs?
I think the legacy of Eugene Debs is a man who was dedicated to improve the condition of the working class, who had a blind spot of issues of race early on in his political career, but developed to become an advocate of Black economic justice in the early 20th century, but still did not go as far as some of his acolytes to his left in fighting for and advocating for Black political and economic and social equality and end of persecution. And that he developed politics that evolved on race. He was not an ideal person, but I think he was a hero of the labor movement, and I think that we should acknowledge the fact that he did move significantly to the left of his own socialist party on the issue of race, and he shouldn't be denied his place for those early missteps, but that he eventually did move on to the point where he was heralded by many Black socialists that I respect, particularly Hubert Harrison.
I would.
Sorry, Derick. What's your ender? We're gonna go a little longer than usual because there's no sadly there's no bonus patron half because our guests did cancel, and these guys were doing us a huge solid, so we can't take up more of Varn and Kuba's time. But sorry, Varn, what is your?
No, I pretty much agree with that assessment, and I think the only thing that I would say is we can't use socialist heroes to avoid the actual history of the larger movements in our history. So like, I think Debs is totally laudable, particularly for what he does in the 19-teens. And he was highly progressive for a socialist on race by the beginning of the 20th century. And there's no denying that. But that his party kind of wasn't, and that has to be dealt with. And I think without dealing with that and the legacy of the SPA and its failure, we can't really deal with the why there is no left in America. I mean, the fact that, for example, there are at least 2, if not 3 organizations that can kind of legitimately claim to be the successor org to the SPA, which died when Max Shachtman effectively dissolved it with the help of Michael Harrington in the late 1960s. That after that you have the SPUSA, the U.S. the DSUSA, I forget the acronym, but it's the Social Democrats of America, which become the DSA in the 80s. And there's another group that claims succession to the Social Democrats of America that is not the DSA. I can't remember their name. So to me, that's a sign of failure. And the fact that no left party in the United States has developed an identity independent of the Democratic Party since 1936 is a sign of our total failure across the board. I mean, yes, we have little Trotskyists and Stalinist sects or whatever, but they're all like never more than 4,000 or 5,000 people. So that's all I have to say on that.
So I think that we're very clear on what the left needs to do if it wants to be the left and not just a collection of people who have a certain ideological propensity, and we need to organize. I mean, the extent to which Eugene Debs is useful as an inspiration or as a model or as a figure that can sort of demonstrate how Western socialists can evolve over time and get to a better place, right? Like, say what you will about Eugene Debs, he never did a no growth. I think that the main thing that we should take away is, like, I kept thinking this was Eugene Debs, but Joe Hill, his last words before he got executed was, "Don't waste time mourning, organize." And maybe we need to find new ways of doing it. And one thing that's clear is that there's no American left without Black people, without the mobilization of Black Americans across the country and cross-racial alliances that target exploitation by people of all races. The Black leadership class, as much as the sort of cosmopolitan haute bourgeoisie that controls the upper levels of capitalism. So, I think that what we need to do is get better at all of the things that we know we need to do.
Here, here. The whiteboard in the background looks like the Oakland PD. I hear they're cracking down on leftists. It's hilarious.
Well, that's not the case. I do want to add, I was throwing this out to Pascal. The people here at the John F. Kennedy Public Library in Vallejo, California, have been very, very nice. And I was going to ask if I did a show, if I did the Saturday show here, would you guys, well, not you guys on the screen, because you guys are in different states and some in undisclosed locations. Would you guys, the listening audience, be down to come through? I know there's a few people in the Bay Area. Come through on a Saturday. I'll get donuts and shit. And we could do the show, have like a live studio audience that would be able to ask questions to the panel live. I'd run out there with my microphone like Phil Donahue. What say you guys? If you guys think it's a good idea, you have until Friday to let me know. I need people to hit Twitter.
This is not for this Saturday, guys. This is for an eventual Saturday.
No, we do it this Saturday. Trust me. We have to think about this Saturday.
Nixon Plummer has spoken.
So, the John F. Kennedy Public Library in Vallejo, California. I'm just gonna throw it out there to them, see how they feel about it, because it probably would be a little bit of a change. But I did find out there's a lawyer that comes here the first and third Wednesday of every month to give legal advice for people awaiting trial. The courthouse also across the street.
Do a show with him.
I do. I want to do, because I've been to that because I was in. So throwing that out there, I need you guys to let me know. Again, hit me up on Twitter, Facebook, This is Revolution, email, booking it, This is Revolution. If you guys are patrons, hit me up on Patreon. Let me know what you think about that, because I'm hella down to do that. I think it would be fun. And, Pascal needs to see me running around with a microphone asking questions to random people.
Okay, yeah, that's what Pascal needs.
That's what you need. And on that note, I want to send a big, warm thank you to Kuba and Varn for agreeing at such short notice to come on here and talk about Eugene Debs for an hour. I mean, keep in mind,
we had a better conversation than we went with the guest.
Being mean to that poor guy that's apparently COVID shitting all over the place. the amount of work that goes into doing these shows, as the men on the screen will tell you, when it comes to like researching a topic and making sure you're prepared. Most guests, more guests than you guys think, ask us what the questions are going to be beforehand. So we really have to, know the angles we're going to take. This threw us a bit of a curveball for these guys to come on so last minute and to just kind of knock it out of the park. I appreciate you guys on a level that you probably will never understand. I'm trying not to get emotional. There's a lot's been going on, but thank you guys very much. I appreciate y'all.
All right, brother. We love you, man.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Every time.
It's great. I always love it.
Thank you. And we are out.